So we know from our research that one of the most powerful predictors of quality, safety, productivity, diversity, you name the result area in organizations, is people's capacity to hold crucial conversations. But what predicts your capacity to hold those crucial conversations in an effective way? Let me describe an experience. I'm sitting in a group of executives with whom I've worked for about 6 months. I'm watching the CFO in particular because he's been strangely silent for the entire 6-month period. I don't know if that would bother you, but for me it was kind of troublesome that here's this organization making enormous capital decisions and the CFO is entirely silent. As I asked around about this, I found out that this had happened about 10 years prior. The man had shut up in executive meetings for 10 years. The incident that started all of this was an argument between the CEO and the CFO. The two of them differed on some important strategic point. The argument got a little bit heated, but it was okay. Everybody was weighing in. Everybody was pushing their point until one crucial moment. At one point, the CFO in exasperation said to the CEO, "I just don't get it. I don't understand why you think what you think there." To which the CEO said, "The reason I think this is because unlike you, I've been working in this industry for the past 15 years. That was the moment when the CFO shut up for 10 years. Here's what we know about crucial conversations. What we know is that one of the greatest barriers to your capacity to talk about emotionally and politically risky issues is the degree to which you start to move to silence or violence and feel good about it. So often during crucial conversations, what happens is we shut down like the CFO, or we start to move to what we call violence. We start to press our point, start to compel, convince, control. I took my son on a wonderful trip a few years back. I had a speech I was doing in Pebble Beach. So I asked him, he was kind of interested in golf, if he wanted to come along. He says, "Oh, Dad, that would be wonderful." We had a wonderful golf vacation, and since the client was picking up the tab, I thought, I got a little loose change in my pocket. He's looking around in the Golf Pro shop, and I watch him looking longingly at these windbreakers with the little cypress tree on them. And so I walked over to him, and I said, "So, Samuel, would you like one of those windbreakers?" And he looks up at me with big doe eyes and says, "Oh, Dad," he said, "could I possibly have one of these?" I said, yeah, let's go try one on. He finds one that fits. We go up to the cash register. I hand him my American Express card. It costs something like $9 million, and you should always check the price first. But I thought, it's once in a lifetime. And so we finished the day. The next morning, we get up early, drive to the airport. We got up too early for breakfast. So when we get to the airport, he goes to one of these fast food places, and he gets this box full of French toast sticks and a big, giant tub of maple syrup. He's wearing his windbreaker. We board the plane. He puts down his little tray. He sticks the French toast sticks on there. He grabs a hold of the foil top to this maple syrup tub, and he pulls, and he pulls, and he pulls, wearing his $9 million windbreaker. He's pulling, and finally, the thing yanks. Whew! All of this maple syrup sprays up into the air and drops down on top of his windbreaker. Well, I'm sitting here in the seat next to him, and I looked over, and I'm waiting for some reaction, some acknowledgement of the horror and devastation that's just taken place. There's none. He grabs a French toast stick, jams it down into the maple thing, starts sloshing it into his mouth, drooling down the front of his windbreaker. I'm sitting here thinking to myself, "You ungrateful brat!" And I'm about to say something. So here's the moment. The moment that predicts how well you do in a crucial conversation is that moment right before you open your mouth. Our tendency during those moments, because of the emotional content of the crucial conversation, is to be tempted to move towards some form of silence like the CFO or the direction that I'm heading right now. Why? Well, here's what we've learned. Through 10,000 hours of observation of people who are magnificently gifted during those moments, here's what we know. What we know is that the way you are about to act during your crucial conversation is going to be largely and profoundly affected by how you feel right now. No big surprise there. That's not rocket science. But here's the big insight. The huge concept, which if you can absorb it, if you can embrace this, if you can deeply understand and learn to master this concept, will give you enormous influence during your crucial conversations. The insight is this: how you feel during a crucial conversation is not a direct function of what you just saw, heard, or experienced. Notice the model. What I see and hear does not create an emotion. Me seeing my son jamming French toast sticks into the middle of this giant tub and drooling it over a $9 million windbreaker does not create anger. It doesn't. A CFO being condescended to and shut down during an executive team meeting in a public setting is not necessarily going to take offense because of what just happened. What he just experienced does not create the emotion. There's an intervening variable called your story. Before you can experience an emotion, you have to tell yourself a story about what just happened to you. Now, the problem is, you and I are hardwired to tell certain kinds of stories. And to the degree you can start to recognize your tendency to tell these types of stories, challenge and change these stories, you gain enormous control over your own emotions. Let me tell you a quick example here. I'm going to ask you to play with this one for a second. I was asked a question a while back from a woman who was struggling with a crucial conversation with her husband. She said, I want you to follow this here. She said, I just found out that over the past 6 months, my husband has had lunch with his ex-girlfriend. Now, the question I want to ask you is, as I start to describe some of that information, what story are you tempted to tell yourself? Think about it for a moment. What sorts of things did you add to the information that I just shared? Well, some obvious concerns might be, is he having more than lunch? Is he having dessert, right? Is there more going on here? Are they fooling around? Is there a relationship? Is he doing something behind my back? But look how, even more subtly, we start to add so much to what's going on in this moment. I want you to go back to what you experienced in your brain when I first started describing what that woman said. I just found out that my husband over the past 6 months has had lunch with his ex-girlfriend. What sort of leaps do we start to make? Now, I don't know if you're like me, but when I heard her talking, I didn't just hear her say lunch, I started to see lunch. Did you do that? I started to imagine what the lunch looked like. And there was a certain kind of restaurant. Was there in your mind? Was it a restaurant with a drive-through? Or was it a restaurant that had linen tablecloths and fine silverware? Was that your restaurant? Was there a candlestick? Were there certain people at the table? Were there a lot of people, or was it just two? In that moment, we start to make lots of inferences. We start to tell certain kinds of stories. Here's my son with maple syrup drool all over the front of him, and the thing that's creating my emotion is not the maple syrup drool. It's the story I start to tell myself about the maple syrup drool. Here's what you and I tend to do. The stories that create our emotions come in two flavors. If you're the kind of person like I am, who frequently feels frustrated in those moments, who can immediately feel frustrated in concerns, the kind of story you tend to tell yourself that creates that emotion is that people are doing what they're doing because they're stupid. They're an idiot. That's why they're doing that. But if you tend frequently to feel deeply offended, hurt, or even angry, there's a different story you're likely telling yourself. The story you're telling yourself is that they're doing what they're doing because they're evil. Not just stupid, but evil. They have malicious intent. They don't care about worthy purposes. They don't care about my concerns. They have their own selfish motives. The problem is they're evil, rotten motives. That story is what creates that escalated emotion and therefore moves you to either silence or violence. If you can learn to intervene and affect that story, it changes everything. Here are the three types of stories you're going to have to learn to watch out for. And the problem is you and I are masters at telling these. So go back with me to the airplane. My son's sitting here next to me. I'm feeling outraged, offended, indignant. Why? Because the story I'm telling myself is a victim story to begin with. Look at what he's doing after all I've done for him. I spent all this money. I go to all this trouble. I make this wonderful experience, and he doesn't care a whit about any of it. Look at the poor victim that I've made myself out to be. You tell yourself that kind of story, and it subtly justifies your moving to silence or violence. Now I can move to violence with my son. I can call him names. I can punish him, and I don't have to feel guilty about it because, after all, I'm an innocent victim. But the victim story isn't enough. You need more to help yourself feel good about silence or violence because, for the most part, you and I believe we shouldn't do those things. We shouldn't withdraw. We should speak up. We shouldn't sort of move to violence and control and compel. But we do anyway. So we need a second kind of story to help us out. We need a villain story. Not only am I an innocent victim, but look at this kid. He is ungrateful. He is selfish. He is undisciplined. He is obnoxious. He is the degree to which I can paint him as evil and awful and rotten is the degree to which I can feel justified now in behaving badly as a parent. Let's move back to the CFO. Same story. He knows as a CFO he has an ethical responsibility to weigh in and have an influence in his executive team meeting. So how can he feel good about 10 years of silence? Number one, I'm a victim. I was mistreated. I was condescended. I was marginalized. Number two, he's a villain. He doesn't care about my opinions. He's controlling. He's obnoxious. He's arrogant. He's egotistical. When I tell myself that kind of story, I create a certain kind of emotion and I create a certain kind of action as a consequence. And I can feel good about those kinds of actions. And finally, I tell myself a helpless story. There's nothing else I could do. Now, where's the power? Where's the leverage? What if you had the capacity to, number one, notice when you told these kinds of stories, but number two, intervene and change them? So here I sit on the plane, and I'm about to leap into punishment and lecture mode with my son. And I bit my lip because I just taught a class on crucial conversations. And I paused for a moment. And I stopped and I asked myself, what story am I telling myself that's making me so mad? Now, it didn't take long to articulate that he's an ungrateful, obnoxious, bratty kid. As soon as I told that story, I found myself capable of crafting a different story. The story sounded a little bit like this. The story was not obnoxious brat. The story was normal 15-year-old kid. Would that change how you felt? Now, notice what I'm not suggesting is I shouldn't hold him accountable. We're going to hold him accountable. We need to talk up to the CEO. We need to be able to hold peers and others accountable. But will I hold them accountable in a better way? As soon as I stepped back and came toward him with the story that said normal 15-year-old boy, here's what my first words sounded like. Samuel, did you notice that you got maple syrup on your cypress tree jacket? Here's what he did. He pushed the French toast stick away. He looked down at his jacket, and he went, "Oh, no!" Started bawling uncontrollably, sitting there on the plane. And then he turns to me and says, "Dad, will it come out?" And I said, "Hey, to the flight attendant, will you please, do you have any club soda? Can we?" The whole situation changed in that moment. Now, what was the problem? Why was he doing what he's doing? Is it because he's an evil, rotten villain? Or is it because he's a dork? Is it because he's a normal 15-year-old boy? And should he learn to be able to manage his goods better than he did? Absolutely. But did he need guilt and punishment? No. What he needs is ability, not motivation. If during those moments you gain the capacity to master your story, to notice the stories you're telling yourself that are creating your emotional response, and intervene and change those, you gain the capacity to step up to crucial conversations that will affect results and relationships in every area of your life.